The weight of 30 tons of steel settles differently on a man's shoulders depending on how many years he has carried it. For James Robert Harrison, that weight had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Some men measure their lives in marriages, in children raised, in houses built. Bull Harrison measured his in the rumble of diesel engines and the smell of gun oil mixed with desert sand. But every story begins before the beginning. Every tank commander learns this truth the first time he climbs into the turret. The steel remembers. The men who came before leave something behind in the metal, in the worn leather of the commander's seat, in the scuff marks on the hatch where countless boots have stood watch, under stars that don't care about borders or flags or the men who die beneath them. West Germany, 1973, the Fulda Gap. The fog rolled across the borderline like a living thing, thick and gray and cold enough to make a young man's bones ache. 23-year-old Second Lieutenant James Harrison stood in the commander's hatch of his M60 Patton tank, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the tree line that marked the edge of East Germany. Somewhere beyond that fog, beyond those trees, sat the Soviet Third Shock Army. 3,000 tanks, 6,000 armored vehicles, 500,000 men who had orders to pour through this gap like water through a broken dam if the word ever came. If, that was the word that kept men awake at night. If war came, if the Cold War turned hot, if today was the day the world decided to end. The radio crackled in his helmet, static and distance, and the voice of a man who had seen 2 wars already and expected to die in a third. Captain Frank McKenzie, Iron Horse to everyone in the battalion, 42 years old and built like the tanks he commanded, all hard angles and weathered steel. He had landed on Normandy Beach at 19, had frozen in Korea at 26. Now he sat in his own M60 300 meters to Bull's left, watching the same tree line, thinking thoughts that men like him never spoke aloud. The voice came through clear despite the static. Each word deliberate, each pause weighted with meaning that textbooks could never teach. Bull, you see that stand of pine trees at your 2 o'clock, about 800 meters out. Bull adjusted his binoculars. The pines materialized through the fog like ghosts becoming solid. He keyed his mic. Got them, Iron Horse. Good. Now imagine 15 T-72 tanks sitting in there, engines cold, crews sleeping in shifts, waiting for an order that might come today or might come never. What do? This was how Mackenzie taught, not with manuals or classrooms or diagrams on chalkboards. He taught with questions that had no easy answers, with scenarios that made you choose between bad options and worse ones, with the kind of wisdom that only came from watching friends die and living with the choices you made that kept you alive when they didn't make it. Bull studied the tree line, calculated fields of fire, considered approach angles and fallback positions. His crew sat below him in the tank. Gunner, loader, driver. 3 men whose lives depended on the quality of his answers. I'd call for artillery, smoke those trees before they can get their engines started. The radio went quiet for 5 seconds. 10. 15. Long enough for Bull to wonder if he had failed some test he didn't know he was taking. Then Mackenzie's voice came back, and something in it had changed. Something had softened. That's the book answer, Lieutenant, and it's a good answer. But here's what 23 years in this steel coffin has taught me. You can destroy those 15 tanks and kill 75 men who were probably conscripts who didn't want to be there any more than you want to be here. Or the pause stretched out like a wire pulled tight. Or you can remember that those men have mothers and wives and children who will never see them again. You can remember that every trigger you pull sends ripples across decades and generations. And then you pull the trigger anyway, because that's the job. But you never forget the weight of it. You never let it become easy. The day killing becomes easy is the day you stop being a soldier and become something else, something less than human. Bull stood in his hatch, 23 years old and suddenly feeling much younger, and understood that Mackenzie was teaching him something that had nothing to do with tactics or weapons or how to kill enemy armor. He was teaching him how to stay human while doing inhuman things, how to carry the weight without letting it crush you, how to live with choices that had no right answers. Yes, sir. The tank is just steel, Bull. 30 tons of it, good American steel, built by men and women in factories who believed in something bigger than themselves. But steel is just steel. It doesn't think. It doesn't feel. It doesn't wake up at 3 in the morning remembering faces. That's what separates us from the machines we remember. We feel the weight, and we carry it anyway. The fog continued to roll across the border. The Soviet tanks continued to sit in their hidden positions. The world continued to balance on the edge of a war that everyone feared and no one wanted. And in that moment, standing in the cold German morning, with his breath making clouds in the air, Bull Harrison began to understand what it truly meant to be a tank commander. 3 weeks later, the lesson would be written in blood and fire. The patrol was supposed to be routine. Nothing in war is ever routine. But the word existed because men needed to believe that some days could pass without death. Bull's platoon, 4 M60 tanks rolling through the fog along a service road that paralleled the border fence. Eyes sharp, weapons ready, but not expecting. Never really expecting. The mine had been placed perfectly. Not in the road itself where sweepers would find it, but 3 meters off the shoulder, hidden under leaves and mud in exactly the spot where a tank would pull off if it needed to stop. Soviet Spetsnaz teams crossed the border sometimes at night, left presents for the Americans, ghosts that killed days after they had vanished back into the east. Mackenzie's tank hit it at 14:37 hours. The explosion lifted 30 tons of steel 6 feet into the air and dropped it back down like a toy. The left track disintegrated. The road wheel assembly tore free. And inside, in the driver's compartment, bones broke and metal became shrapnel, and a man who had survived Normandy and Korea learned that even iron horses can be killed. Bull's driver had stopped their tank the instant the explosion registered. Training took over. Bull was on the radio calling for medevac before conscious thought caught up with instinct. But another part of his brain was running calculations that had nothing to do with radio protocols or casualty evacuation procedures. The orders were clear. In the event of a disabled vehicle in the border zone, assess the tactical situation. Determine if recovery is feasible without additional risk. If enemy action is suspected, fall back to defensive positions and wait for quick reaction force. Do not, under any circumstances, expose additional vehicles to potential ambush. Bull looked at Mackenzie's tank. Smoke poured from the hatches. The radio was dead. No movement visible. He looked at the tree line, at the open ground between his position and the disabled vehicle, at the sector of fire that any Soviet observer team would have on anyone who tried to cross that ground. 75 meters of open terrain that could be covered by machine gun fire, tank cannons, or another mine waiting for the rescue attempt. The book said fall back. The book said wait for support. The book said one disabled tank was better than two. Bull looked at his gunner, at his loader, at his driver. 3 pairs of eyes looking back at him, waiting for the order. He thought about Mackenzie's voice 3 weeks ago, about steel and humanity, about the weight of choices, about what it meant to be the man in the commander's hatch. Driver, move up. Gunner, cover that tree line. Loader, get the fire extinguisher ready. We're going in. His driver's voice came back steady despite what they were all thinking. Roger, sir. The 75 meters took forever and no time at all. Bull stood in his hatch, fully exposed, eyes scanning for threats while his mind screamed that this was suicide, that the book existed for reasons, that getting more men killed wouldn't bring Mackenzie back. But his hands stayed steady on the machine gun, and his voice stayed calm on the radio, and his tank kept moving forward because that's what leaders did. They made the choice and lived with the consequences. No second mine exploded, no ambush materialized from the tree line. Sometimes luck exists, though men in war learn not to trust it. Bull's crew got Mackenzie out, got the other 3 crew members out, set up a perimeter while the medevac helicopter came in, its rotors beating the air like the heartbeat of a giant mechanical bird. Mackenzie was alive. Barely. His left leg was gone below the knee, taken by shrapnel and physics in the random chance that governs who lives and who dies. They loaded him onto the helicopter. Bull stood at attention as it lifted off, even though regulations didn't require it, because some things mattered more than regulations. 3 days later, in a hospital in Frankfurt, Mackenzie gave Bull something that would follow him for the next 50 years. A Zippo lighter. Chrome worn smooth by decades of thumbs opening and closing it, engraved on the side in letters that had been filled and refilled with ink over the years. Never leave a man behind, never leave a tank behind. Normandy, 1944. Mackenzie's voice was weak, full of morphine and pain that medicine couldn't touch. My platoon sergeant gave this to me on Omaha Beach, after he pulled me out of a burning Sherman while Germans were still shooting at us. I've carried it every day since, through Korea, through all of this Cold War nonsense, through 3 marriages and 4 kids and more bad decisions than I can count. Now it's yours. Bull tried to refuse. Mackenzie cut him off with a look that made clear this wasn't a request. You disobeyed a direct order to come get me, Lieutenant. By the book, you should be court-martialed. Instead, you're getting a medal and a promotion. Want to know why? Because you understood what the book can never teach. That steel is steel, but men are something more. That sometimes the right choice and the regulation choice aren't the same thing. That a tank commander's first duty is to the men in his steel, not to the steel itself. Mackenzie closed his eyes, opened them again, focused on Bull with an intensity that pushed through the pain. 50 years from now, you'll be old like me. You'll have scars like me. You'll wake up at 3 a.m. like me, seeing faces of men who didn't make it home. And some young lieutenant will be standing where you're standing now, trying to figure out how to live with the weight. Give him this lighter. Tell him what I told you. Make sure the chain doesn't break. Bull left Germany 2 months later with a Silver Star, a promotion to first lieutenant, and a chrome Zippo that weighed about 2 ounces but felt like 30 tons. Fort Benning, Georgia, present-day 224. The museum opened at 0900 hours, but Bull Harrison was always there by 0730. Some habits die hard, some habits never die at all. They just become part of who you are, like scars or calluses, or the particular way a man walks after spending 40 years climbing in and out of tank hatches. At 74 years old, Bull moved with the careful deliberation of a man who knew his body was a machine that had logged too many miles and taken too many hits. His knees complained on stairs. His back protested in cold weather. The hearing in his left ear was mostly gone, courtesy of too many main gun firings before the Army figured out that hearing protection might be a good idea. But his eyes were still sharp and his hands stayed steady, and when he walked through the halls of the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor, surrounded by 50 years of steel and history, something in him came alive that made 74 feel like 23 again. The M60 Patton in the main hall was not the same tank he had commanded in Germany, but it might as well have been. Same flat turret, same long barrel, same brutal functionality that made it look less like a machine and more like pure violence given form. Bull ran his hand along the fender as he passed, the way a man might touch the shoulder of an old friend. Morning, Emma. He named all the tanks. The staff thought it was charming in a grandfatherly sort of way. They didn't understand that to Bull, these weren't exhibits or artifacts or pieces of military history. They were comrades. They were the steel that had kept him alive when everything else was trying to kill him. They deserved names. They deserved respect. The M48 in the next hall was George. The M4 Sherman by the entrance was Frank, named for Mackenzie, who had died in 20 at 91 years old, finally succumbing to the injuries that 30 tons of steel and a Soviet mine had inflicted decades before. The M1 Abrams in the special exhibit hall, the one with the Desert Storm placard and the list of kills painted on the barrel, was Providence. Steel Providence, the tank that had carried Bull and 3 other men through the largest tank battle since World War II and brought all of them home alive. Bull stopped in front of Steel Providence every morning, stood at attention for 30 seconds, not because regulations required it, but because some things mattered more than regulations. The voice behind him was soft, female, carrying the particular tone of someone who had learned not to startle a man who had spent too many years in places where sudden noises meant death. You know, Colonel Harrison, most volunteers don't come in 2 hours before opening. Bull turned. Helen Martinez, the museum director, stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. Mid-50s, former Army herself, military intelligence. She understood men like Bull in a way that civilians never could. She knew that for some people, the museum wasn't a poem or a hobby. It was church, it was therapy. It was the only place where the ghosts spoke a language that made sense. Bull accepted the coffee with a nod that was almost a bow. Old-fashioned manners from a generation that believed some courtesies should never die. Couldn't sleep, ma'am. Figured I might as well make myself useful. Helen sipped her coffee and studied him with a particular insight that came from years of reading people instead of situations. Today's the 26th. It wasn't a question. Bull nodded. February 26th, the day in 1991 when 5,000 American and British troops had crashed into 3 Iraqi Republican Guard divisions in the middle of a desert sandstorm. The Battle of 73 Easting. 90 minutes of fire and steel and smoke so thick you couldn't see 30 meters. When it was over, the Iraqis had lost 85 tanks, 40 armored vehicles, and nearly 1,000 men. The Americans had lost one Bradley fighting vehicle. One. Bull had been there. Captain Harrison then, commanding a tank platoon in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Steel Providence had killed 11 Iraqi T-72 tanks that day. Bull could still remember every shot, the way the reticle settled on the target, the calm voice of his gunner calling identified, his own voice responding, fire, the tank rocking back from the recoil, the distant explosion as a Soviet-built tank became a fireball in the desert. 11 times, 11 crews, maybe 50 men total, though the exact number changed depending on whether the tanks were running full or combat-effective crews. 50 men who went to work that morning and never came home. 50 mothers and wives and children who lost someone because Bull Harrison was better at his job than they were at theirs. The book said it was warfare. The book said it was necessary. The book said it was something to be proud of. The book didn't wake up at 3 a.m. seeing faces in the darkness. Helen's voice pulled him back from 1991 to 2024. Marcus called. He and the others will be here around 1500 hours, same as every year. Bull nodded. Marcus Williams, Thomas O'Brien, Jose Ramirez. The 3 men who had shared 30 tons of steel with him through the worst 90 minutes any of them ever experienced. The only people in the world who understood what 73 Easting really meant. Beyond the official histories and the sanitized documentary footage, and the medals that looked impressive, but couldn't capture the smell of burning fuel and the sound of men screaming in Arabic over the radio as their tanks exploded around them. They met every year on this day, had been meeting for 33 years, would keep meeting until the last of them died, which given their ages and the various ways war had marked them, probably wouldn't be much longer. Bull finished his coffee and handed the empty cup back to Helen with another small bow. Thank you, ma'am. I'll be in the restoration shop if anyone needs me. She watched him walk away, this old man who moved like steel wrapped in skin, and wondered not for the first time what it cost to carry that kind of history, what it did to a soul to be good at killing and have to live with being good at it. The restoration shop was Bull's favorite place in the museum. Here, surrounded by parts and tools and tanks in various states of disassembly, he could work with his hands and let his mind go quiet. The staff knew to leave him alone, knew that whatever ghost haunted him needed this space to rest. He was elbow deep in an M4 Sherman transmission, fighting with a stuck gear that had probably been stuck since 1944. When his phone rang, Bull didn't carry a cell phone by choice. The museum made him carry one for safety reasons. He was 74, working around heavy machinery, and the staff had nightmares about finding him crushed under a tank component. He wiped his hands on a rag and checked the screen. Unknown number. Probably telemarketer. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Maybe intuition, maybe the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 wars and 40 years of training accidents. Maybe just luck. Harrison. The voice on the other end was familiar and professional and carried the weight of rank even through phone static. Colonel Harrison, this is Brigadier General Sarah Hartman. I'm sorry to call unannounced, sir, but I need to speak with you about a matter of some urgency. Bull straightened up. Brigadier General Sarah Hartman. He knew the name, knew the face, though he hadn't seen it in person for almost 10 years. She had been a captain in his last command, back when Bull was running advanced armor tactics at Fort Knox before his retirement. Smart, driven, the kind of officer who would either burn out by 40 or make general by 50. Apparently she had chosen the latter path. General, it's been a while. What can I do for you? A pause on the other end of the line. The particular pause of someone choosing words carefully because they were about to ask for something difficult. Sir, I'm currently commanding the armor school here at Benning. We have a situation with our tank commander qualification course. I'd like to discuss it with you in person if possible. Are you available this afternoon? Bull looked at the Sherman transmission, at the tools spread across the workbench, at the comfortable solitude of the restoration shop. Then he looked at Steel Providence through the open door, sitting in the exhibit hall like a monument to things that most people wanted to forget. I can be at your office at 1100 hours, General. Thank you, sir. I'll have a visitor pass ready at the main gate. The line went dead. Bull stood in the workshop holding his phone and feeling the particular sensation that comes when the past reaches forward into the present and drags you back into something you thought you had left behind. He wiped down his tools, cleaned his hands, changed into a clean shirt that didn't have transmission fluid on it, Told Helen he had an appointment and would be back later. Drove his 20-year-old Ford pickup truck through the Fort Benning main gate at exactly 10:55 hours, because being early was on time, and being on time was late, and being late was unacceptable. General Hartman's office was in the Armor School headquarters building, a modern structure that looked nothing like the wooden barracks and Quonset huts Bull remembered from his early days. The Army had changed, buildings had changed, technology had changed, but as Bull walked through the halls, seeing young soldiers in their camouflage uniforms, hearing the particular sounds of a military installation, the barked orders and the running feet and the diesel engines in the distance, he understood that some things never changed at all. The fundamentals remained, the weight remained, the steel remained. General Hartman met him in her outer office, not waiting for her aide to announce him, moving with the crisp efficiency of a flag officer who had earned her stars through competence rather than politics. She was 52 now, Bull calculated, which meant she had been maybe 30 when he had last worked with her. Time had added gray to her hair and lines around her eyes, but hadn't diminished the sharp intelligence that Bull remembered. They shook hands. Hartman gestured to her inner office. Bull followed, noting the photos on the walls. Tank units, deployment photos. A picture of a younger Hartman standing in front of an M1 Abrams with a crew of 4, all of them grinning like they owned the world. Hartman closed the door, gestured to a chair, sat across from Bull with the desk between them like a neutral zone. "Thank you for coming, sir. I know you're retired and I have no official authority to request your time, but I'm asking anyway, because we have a problem and I think you might be the only person who can help solve it." Bull waited. Let her talk. One of Mackenzie's lessons: let people tell their story at their own pace. You learn more from what they chose to emphasize than from what they said. Hartman pulled a folder from her desk drawer, opened it, turned it so Bull could see the contents. Charts, statistics, performance metrics. Tank Commander Qualification Course, 12-week program. We've been running it for 40 years with a fairly consistent pass rate of 78 to 82%. Last year, that dropped to 65%. This year, we're at 32%. 32, sir. 2/3 of our candidates are failing. Bull studied the charts. The trend was unmistakable. Something had changed, something fundamental. What's different? Hartman leaned back in her chair. Bull recognized the body language, the particular tension of a commander who knew what the answer was but didn't like having to say it out loud. Everything and nothing. The tanks are better. M1A2 SEPV3, most advanced armor platform in the world. Computers that do calculations our generation needed slide rules for. Thermal sights that can see through smoke and sand and darkness. Training simulators that can replicate any combat scenario ever recorded. She paused. The pause was important. But the candidates themselves, they're different. They grew up with computers, with GPS, with systems that tell them exactly what to do and when to do it. They're technically proficient. They can operate the equipment, but they can't lead. They can't make decisions when the computers fail, or the radios go down, or the plan falls apart, and they're sitting in 30 tons of steel with 3 other people who are looking to them for answers. Bull understood before she finished speaking. Had seen this coming years ago, back when the Army started putting video game consoles in rec centers and calling it pre-training. Technology was a tool, a valuable tool, but it wasn't a substitute for the kind of judgment that only came from experience, from failure, from making hard choices and living with the consequences. "You want me to teach them what computers can't?" Hartman nodded. "We had a training accident 3 weeks ago. Simulated combat exercise at the National Training Center. One of our top candidates, highest technical scores in his class, gave an order at the wrong time based on what his screens were telling him instead of what his eyes could see. The loader didn't question it, followed the order. In a real fight, that loader would be dead." She closed the folder with a finality that felt like a door shutting. The candidate's name is Second Lieutenant Jake Reynolds, 23 years old, smart, dedicated, absolutely devastated by what happened. He's facing a board of inquiry next week that will almost certainly end his career before it starts. Bull waited for the other shoe to drop. There was more. There was always more. Hartman opened another folder. This one had a photograph clipped to the inside cover. An old photograph, faded and creased from being carried in a wallet for decades. Bull knew that photograph, knew the man in it. Frank Mackenzie, Iron Horse, standing in front of his M60 Patton in Germany, 1973, young and strong and whole, before Soviet mines and American hospitals had taken his leg, and 20 years later, his life. Bull looked at Hartman, looked at the photograph, felt the weight of 50 years settling onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. Jake Reynolds is Frank Mackenzie's grandson. Hartman nodded. Mackenzie left instructions in his will. If his grandson ever joined the army, if he ever went into armor, someone was supposed to find you, tell you. He believed you owed him something. Bull reached into his pocket, pulled out the chrome Zippo lighter that had lived there for 50 years, set it on the desk between them. The engraving caught the light. Never leave a man behind. Never leave a tank behind. Normandy, 1944. He was right, I owe him my life. He gave me this lighter and told me to pass it on to someone who understood what it meant. Hartman looked at this lighter, looked at Bull. Understanding passed between them without words. Jake Reynolds is facing failure because he's technically perfect, but tactically lost. He needs someone who can teach him what the simulators can't, what the manuals don't say, how to make decisions when there's no right answer and people die either way. He needs a tank commander who's been where he is and survived it. Bull picked up the lighter, felt its familiar weight, thought about Mackenzie pulling him out of that German fog 50 years ago, thought about the chain of knowledge and wisdom and hard-earned lessons that stretched back through generations of men who had sat in tanks and made impossible choices. I'm 74 years old, General. I haven't commanded a tank in 9 years. I'm not qualified to train anyone. Hartman's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Recognition, respect. With respect, sir, that's precisely why you're qualified. These candidates need someone who remembers what it was like before computers, before GPS, before all the technology that makes them think warfare is clean and precise and predictable. They need someone who can teach them that tank commanding isn't about systems and screens. It's about 4 people in a steel box trusting each other with their lives. It's about making calls in 0.3 seconds that you'll think about for the next 50 years. It's about carrying weight that never gets lighter. Bull stood, walked to the window, looked out at Fort Benning, at the ranges and training areas and buildings that had turned raw recruits into soldiers for generations. Somewhere out there, Jake Reynolds was probably sitting in a barracks room, 23 years old and facing the end of his career, carrying the weight of a mistake that hadn't killed anyone, but easily could have. Bull remembered being 23, remembered standing in the fog at the Fulda Gap, learning lessons that textbooks couldn't teach. Remembered Mackenzie's voice on the radio, patient and firm and insistent that steel was steel, but men were something more. 50 years ago, someone had invested time and wisdom and patience in making sure Bull Harrison understood what it meant to be a tank commander, had given him tools that weren't in any manual, had passed down knowledge that stretched back through Normandy and the Bulge and Kasserine Pass and every other place where men in steel had faced death and had to make choices about how to meet it. The chain didn't break. That was the rule, the unwritten law, the obligation that came with the lighter in his pocket and the scars on his body and the faces in his dreams at 3 a.m. Bull turned back to Hartman. What exactly are you asking me to do? Hartman stood, came around the desk, stood at attention like she was addressing a superior officer despite the fact that Bull had been retired for 9 years, and she outranked him anyway. 90 days, 4 candidates, Jake Reynolds and 3 others who are facing similar failures for similar reasons. Teach them what computers can't. Teach them what simulators don't cover. Teach them how to be tank commanders instead of just tank operators. Do it however you think best. I'll clear any obstacles, get you any resources. You'll have full authority and my complete support. Bull felt the lighter in his pocket, felt the weight of Mackenzie's trust, felt the obligation that came with surviving when others didn't. I want to meet them first, all 4. No officers present, just me and them in complete honesty about what they're facing. Done. I want access to the old equipment. M1 Abrams, original variant. No upgrades, no digital systems. The way it was in 1991. Hartman hesitated. Bull understood. The old tanks were museum pieces now, kept for display and demonstration, not active training. I can make that happen, but I'll need to know why. Bull touched the lighter through his pocket, because before they can learn to use the technology, they need to learn to be tank commanders without it. They need to understand what steel feels like when there's nothing between them and death except 30 tons of metal and 3 other people who are just as scared as they are. They need to learn that the tank is just a tool. The real weapon is the crew. Hartman thought about it for 3 seconds, nodded. Steel Providence is in the museum exhibit hall. I'll have it transferred to the training area by Monday. Anything else? Bull walked to the door, stopped, turned back. I'm going to tell them things the Army doesn't want them to hear. About fear and failure and the weight of command. About the men I killed and the men I couldn't save. About waking up at 3 a.m. for 50 years seeing faces. If you want them to be real tank commanders, they need to know the cost. All of it. Hartman met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had been in combat herself and understood that the real wounds weren't always visible. That's exactly what they need to hear, Colonel. That's exactly why I called you. Bull left the office, walked through the headquarters building, drove his pickup truck back to the museum, arrived at 14:30 hours, 90 minutes before Marcus and Thomas and Jose would show up for their annual reunion, their ritual remembrance of the day 33 years ago when 4 men in a tank had done their jobs and survived when thousands hadn't. He found Helen in her office, told her he would be taking a leave of absence for 90 days. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and said Steel Providence would be his whenever he needed it, because some things mattered more than museum schedules. Bull walked through the exhibit hall, stood in front of Steel Providence, put his hand on the armor plate, felt the steel that had carried him through hell and brought him home. Somewhere in this fort, Jake Reynolds was sitting in a barracks room, carrying weight that threatened to crush him, needing someone to teach him what Mackenzie had taught Bull 50 years ago in a German fog. That steel was steel, but men were something more. That the weight never got lighter. You just got stronger carrying it. That a tank commander's first duty was to the men in his steel, not to the steel itself. That the chain didn't break. The knowledge passed down. The wisdom earned in blood and fire and choices that haunted you forever. Bull took out the Zippo, opened it, closed it, felt the familiar click that had been with him for half a century. The lighter would pass to Jake Reynolds, eventually, when he was ready, when he understood what it meant. But first, Bull had 90 days to make sure Jake Reynolds survived long enough to deserve it. Marcus Williams arrived first, at exactly 14:45 hours, 15 minutes early the way career military men always did. He drove an immaculate 1987 Buick LeSabre, powder blue, maintained with the same attention to detail he had once given to tank systems and fire control computers. The car door opened with a solid thunk that spoke of American manufacturing before planned obsolescence became standard practice. Bull watched from the museum steps as Marcus extracted himself from the driver's seat with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered too many impacts, too many hard landings, too many days sitting in positions that human spines were never designed to endure. At 73, Marcus moved like architecture, all right angles and deliberate shifts of weight. The eye patch over his left eye was black leather, worn smooth by decades of wear. He had lost that eye to shrapnel in Desert Storm, a piece of Iraqi tank that had decided his face was softer than American armor plate. They met halfway across the parking lot. No words, just the particular handshake that men develop when they have trusted each other with their lives. Not the crushing grip of men trying to prove something, but the solid connection of men who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a Baptist preacher, which was exactly what he had become after the Army decided one-eyed men couldn't command tanks anymore. You look tired, Bull, more than usual. Bull nodded. Marcus saw things other people missed. Always had. As a gunner, that skill meant identifying targets before they identified you. As a friend, it meant knowing when someone was carrying weight they couldn't speak about. Got a call this morning from the armor school. Marcus's one good eye studied Bull's face with the intensity of a man reading a fire control computer display. They want something. They want 90 days, teaching 4 candidates who are about to wash out. And you said yes. It wasn't a question. Marcus knew Bull the way you only know someone after sitting in 30 tons of steel together while the world outside tried to kill you. Knew that Bull couldn't walk away from someone who needed teaching. Knew that the lighter in Bull's pocket was more than chrome and engraving. It was an obligation that compounded with every year, every student, every chance to pass something forward that should never be lost. Thomas O'Brien's pickup truck pulled into the lot at 14:52 hours. Newer than Bull's, which wasn't saying much but maintained with the casual competence of a man who had spent his life making machines work. Tommy Gunn, they had called him in Desert Storm, partly because of his name and partly because he could load main gun rounds faster than anyone in the battalion. 5.2 seconds, average. Even in the chaos of combat, when your hands were shaking and your ears were ringing, and somewhere outside men were dying. Tommy climbed out of the truck and Bull saw immediately that he was having a bad day. The two fingers on Tommy's right hand, the ones the Army doctors had reattached after a loading accident in 1992, weren't moving right. Nerve damage. Some days were better than others. Today was not one of the better ones. Tommy saw Bull looking, held up the damaged hand with a grin that had no humor in it. Barometric pressure. Doc says the nerves remember the trauma when the weather changes. I say the doc is full of medical school nonsense, but the fingers don't lie. He crossed the lot with the rolling gait of a former loader, someone who had learned to move in confined spaces, to shift weight without warning, to be exactly where he needed to be even when the tank was moving and the main gun was firing, and the loader's compartment was full of brass casings and diesel fumes and the particular smell of cordite that stuck in your clothes for days. The three of them stood together in the parking lot, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Three old men in jeans and button-up shirts, looking like retirees meeting for coffee, carrying between them enough combat experience to fill textbooks that would never be written because some knowledge could only be transmitted directly, hand to hand, steel to steel, from men who had been there to men who needed to know. Jose Ramirez's car appeared at 14:58 hours. A Honda Civic, 15 years old, desert tan, paint faded to the color of old bones. Jose drove with the particular caution of someone who no longer trusted himself behind the wheel, someone whose reflexes had been rewired by trauma into seeing threats that didn't exist and missing dangers that did. He parked at the far end of the lot, sat in the car for 2 full minutes before getting out. Bull understood. Jose was gathering himself, building the walls that let him function in public spaces, pushing down the parts of his brain that wanted to scan for threats and calculate fields of fire and identify covered routes of egress. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the doctors called it. Jose called it the price of admission, the cost of survival. The weight you carried when you came home and everyone else didn't. Jose crossed the lot like he was walking through a minefield, each step deliberate, eyes moving constantly, never quite meeting anyone's gaze directly. At 71, he looked older than the other three combined. PTSD aged you in ways that time alone couldn't match. Stole sleep, stole peace, stole the comfortable certainty that the world was a safe place where bad things only happened to other people. Bull stepped forward, put a hand on Jose's shoulder, felt the tension there, coiled like a spring wound too tight for too long. Ghost, you made it. Jose's eyes focused, came back from whatever battlefield they had been visiting. He managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but was genuine nonetheless. Wouldn't miss it, Jefe. 33 years we made a promise. They had. Standing in the desert in Kuwait, February 27th, 1991, the day after the battle, when the adrenaline had worn off and the reality of what they had survived was sinking in. 4 men who had shared 90 minutes that felt like 90 years, who had seen things that would follow them forever, who had made a pact that as long as they were alive, they would meet on this day and remember. Not celebrate, remember. There was a difference. The 4 of them walked into the museum together. Helen saw them coming and simply nodded, understanding that these men needed space and time and the particular solitude that only exists in the presence of people who truly understand. She locked the front door behind them, flipped the sign to closed, and disappeared into her office. They stood in front of Steel Providence for 10 minutes without speaking. The tank sat under careful lighting, polished and maintained, looking nothing like it had looked in '91 when it was covered in desert sand and diesel smoke, and the particular grime that comes from being a machine designed to kill other machines. But Bull could see past the museum polish to the reality underneath, could see the small dent in the turret where an Iraqi round had hit but not penetrated, could see the faint scorch marks around the main gun where burning propellant had scorched the paint, could see the ghost of blood on the loader's station where Tommy had cut his hand and refused to stop working because stopping meant dying. Marcus spoke first, his preacher's voice soft in the empty hall. I had the dream again last night, the one where we're still there, still in the fight, still young enough to think we're immortal. Thomas nodded. I don't dream about it anymore. But I think about it. Every day, every single day, the sound of the main gun, the way the whole tank would rock back when we fired, the smell, God, the smell, burning fuel and hot metal and fear. You can't wash that smell out. It gets into your bones. Jose stared at the tank like he was seeing through it to something beyond, something only he could see. I dreamed that we died there, all of us, that this is the afterlife and we just don't know it yet, that we're ghosts walking around thinking we're alive while our real bodies are still in the sand, still burning, still waiting for someone to find us and bring us home. Bull let the words sit in the air between them. This was the ritual, the speaking of truths that couldn't be spoken anywhere else, the acknowledgement of costs that no one wanted to calculate, the sharing of weight that was too heavy for one man to carry alone. I need to tell you something about why I asked you all to come early this year. Three pairs of eyes turned to him, three men who knew him well enough to recognize the tone, the particular weight in his voice that meant something had changed, something was coming, something that would require them to be more than just old men remembering old wars. Bull told them about General Hartman's call, about Jake Reynolds, about four candidates facing failure because they had learned to operate tanks but not to command them, about 90 days in an old M1 and the obligation that came with the lighter in his pocket. When he finished, Thomas spoke first. You're 74 years old, Bull. You earned retirement. You earned peace. You don't owe the Army anything else. Marcus shook his head. He doesn't owe the Army. He owes Mackenzie. He owes the chain. Same way Mackenzie owed the sergeant who pulled him out of that Sherman in Normandy. Same way we owe Bull for getting us through 73 Easting alive. Jose's voice was quiet but carried weight. What do you need from us? Bull looked at Steel Providence, looked at his crew, looked at three men who had every right to say no, who had given enough, who had earned the right to let someone else carry the weight for a while. I need you to help me teach them, not tactics, not procedures, the other stuff, the things that aren't in the manuals, what it feels like, what it costs, how to live with it afterward. Thomas held up his damaged hand. You want us to tell them war stories, make it sound glorious? I want you to tell them the truth, all of it. The parts we don't talk about at reunions or in bars or anywhere that civilians can hear. I want you to show them what 33 years of carrying 73 Easting looks like, so they understand what they're signing up for, so they go in with eyes open. The three of them looked at each other, the silent communication of men who had trusted each other with their lives. Marcus nodded first, then Thomas. Finally Jose, though his nod was slower, more reluctant, the movement of a man being asked to open doors he had spent decades trying to keep closed. When do we start? Bull checked his watch. 15:37 hours. I meet the candidates Monday morning. I'll need you there by Wednesday. That gives me 2 days to see what I'm working with. Monday morning, 0600 hours. Fort Benning Training Area 7. The sun was still below the horizon when Bull arrived at the training area. Steel Providence sat on a concrete pad surrounded by nothing but red Georgia clay and pine trees. Someone had delivered it from the museum over the weekend, transported on a flatbed truck like a relic from an archaeological dig, which Bull supposed was essentially what it was. A 40-year-old tank, no digital fire control, no thermal sights, no GPS, just steel and mechanics in the kind of brutal simplicity that either worked or didn't, with no gray area in between. Bull climbed onto the tank with movements that were automatic despite 9 years of retirement. Hand here, foot there. Pull yourself up with your arms because your knees won't do it anymore. Settle into the commander's hatch like sitting in a chair you had occupied for so long that your body remembered the exact shape of it. The interior smelled like oil and old metal and something else, something that couldn't quite be washed away no matter how thoroughly the museum staff cleaned. The smell of men under stress, of fear and sweat and adrenaline, of history that had soaked into the steel itself. Bull sat in the commander's seat and let the memories come. Didn't fight them. Mackenzie had taught him that too. The memories were part of the weight. Trying to suppress them only made them heavier. Better to acknowledge them, give them their moment, then put them back in whatever box they lived in and get on with the work. The four candidates arrived at 0630 hours in a military van. Bull watched them from the commander's hatch as they climbed out. Four young people in physical training uniforms, looking at the old tank, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to confusion to barely concealed disdain. Second Lieutenant Jake Reynolds was easy to identify. He had Mackenzie's build, tall and broad-shouldered, with the particular posture of someone carrying invisible weight. His face was young, but his eyes were older than they should have been. Bull recognized that look, had seen it in mirrors for 50 years, the look of someone who had made a mistake that cost lives and didn't know how to live with it. The woman was Corporal Maria Santos, 5'6", maybe 130 pounds, moving with the controlled aggression of someone who had spent her life proving she belonged in spaces that didn't want her. Her uniform was pressed sharp enough to cut. Her boots gleamed. Everything about her screamed competence and determination and barely contained anger at a world that constantly questioned whether she had earned her place. The large black man was Private First Class Deshaun Miller. 6'5" easy, shoulders like a linebacker, hands that looked like they could bend steel. He moved with the careful grace of very large men who have learned that their size intimidates people, who have trained themselves to take up less space than they actually occupy. His expression was neutral, professional, giving nothing away. The youngest was Private Ethan Park. Korean features, wire-rimmed glasses that had no place in a combat arms unit, moving with the uncertain body language of someone still figuring out how his limbs worked. He looked at the tank the way a computer programmer might look at an abacus, with the particular confusion of someone confronting technology that predated their entire frame of reference. Bull waited until they had formed up in a rough line in front of the tank. Let them stand there for 30 seconds. A minute, long enough for them to start wondering what was happening, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the particular tone that had once commanded platoons and companies and battalions. My name is Colonel James Harrison. Most people call me Bull. You will call me Bull. Not Sir, not Colonel, just Bull. For the next 90 days, I am not your superior officer. I am not your instructor. I am something else, something that doesn't have a rank or a job description. I am the person standing between you and the end of your careers. He paused. Let that sink in. You are here because you failed. Each of you, in different ways, demonstrated that you can operate a tank but cannot command one. The Army has invested millions of dollars in your training, thousands of hours, countless resources, and you have failed to demonstrate the one quality that cannot be taught in a classroom or programmed into a simulator. You have failed to demonstrate judgment. Maria's jaw tightened. Bull saw it, continued. Judgment is not the same as intelligence. Lieutenant Reynolds, you have the highest technical scores in your class. Your understanding of tank systems is exceptional. But when you gave the order that nearly killed your loader, your judgment failed. You trusted your screens more than your eyes. You processed data instead of reading the situation. And in doing so, you demonstrated that you are an excellent tank operator and a dangerous tank commander. Jake's face went pale, but he held Bull's gaze. Good, that took courage. Corporal Santos, you have scores that put you in the top 10% of all armor candidates. Your gunnery is excellent. Your tactical knowledge is solid, but you failed the command evaluation because when your simulated platoon came under fire, you gave 17 orders in 30 seconds. 17. Your crew didn't know which order to follow because you were too busy demonstrating that you knew everything to actually lead anything. Maria's hands clenched into fists. Bull saw that too. Private Miller, you have the physical capability to be an outstanding loader. You're strong enough to handle main gun rounds all day without fatigue. But you're too slow, 7.3 seconds per load, when standard is 5 or under. You know why you're slow? Because you're thinking about it. You're treating each round like it's a weight you're lifting at the gym. You haven't internalized that when you're slow, people die. Your tank commander dies. Your gunner dies, your driver dies, and then you die. But you die last, which means you get to spend your final seconds knowing you killed them. Deshaun's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, understanding. Private Park, you have an IQ of 152. You understand tank systems better than some of the engineers who designed them. But you failed the crew evaluation because when your loader collapsed from heat exhaustion during a training exercise, you froze. You spent 9 seconds calculating options while your crew member was dying. 9 seconds. Do you know what happens in 9 seconds in combat? Ethan swallowed hard, shook his head. Everything. In 9 seconds, you can die 3 different ways. In 9 seconds, your entire platoon can be destroyed. In 9 seconds, the battle you were winning becomes the battle you lost. And you spent those 9 seconds thinking instead of acting. Bull climbed down from the tank, moved with deliberate slowness so his knees wouldn't betray how much the descent hurt. Stood facing the four candidates at ground level. Four young people looking at an old man who was telling them things they didn't want to hear but needed to understand. The Army thinks you failed because you lack training. I think you failed because you lack understanding. You understand tanks. You understand systems and procedures and protocols, but you don't understand what it means to sit in 30 tons of steel with the three other people who are trusting you with their lives. You don't understand the weight. You don't understand the cost. You don't understand that being a tank commander has nothing to do with rank or technology or how smart you are. It has to do with whether you can make decisions in zero point 0.3 seconds that you'll think about for the next 50 years, and then make another decision in the next zero point 0.3 seconds, and keep making decisions while everything is on fire and people are screaming and your training is telling you one thing and your instincts are telling you another, and you have to choose. He gestured at Steel Providence. This tank is 40 years old. No computers, no GPS, no thermal sights, no automated systems. For the next 90 days, this is your tank. You will learn to operate it. You will learn to maintain it. You will learn to fight it. And you will learn to do all of that without any of the technology you have come to depend on. Because I need you to understand something fundamental. The technology is not what makes you a tank commander. The steel is not what makes you a tank commander. The only thing that makes you a tank commander is the three people sitting in that steel with you and your absolute commitment to bringing them home alive. Jake spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the particular hoarseness of someone fighting to keep emotions under control. My grandfather knew you, Captain Frank Mackenzie. Bull nodded. Iron Horse Mackenzie. He saved my life in Germany 50 years ago, taught me everything I know about commanding tanks. Gave me something that I'll show you when you're ready to receive it. But first, you need to earn the right to see it. You need to prove that you understand what your grandfather understood. That steel is steel, but men are something more. Maria's voice came out sharp, challenging. With respect, Colonel, this is 2024. Women serve in armor now. When you say men, are you including me, or should I just leave now? Bull met her eyes directly. When I say men, Corporal Santos, I mean human beings who have chosen to put on a uniform and climb into a tank and trust each other with their lives. I mean people who understand that out there. In the steel, gender doesn't matter, and race doesn't matter, and age doesn't matter, and the only thing that matters is whether you can do your job and trust your crew to do theirs. Your grandfather fought in 3 wars. Your father fought in 2. You have 3 generations of tank commanders in your blood. So don't ask me if I'm including you. Ask yourself if you're ready to live up to what your family has already proven. Maria's expression shifted. The anger morphed into something else. Recognition. Respect. Bull turned to face all 4 of them. For the next 12 weeks, you will be here 6 days a week. 600 to 1800. Sundays off because even God rested on the 7th day. You will learn this tank inside and out. You will learn to operate every station. Commander, gunner, loader, driver. You will rotate through each position until you can do any job blindfolded. Because the day your gunner gets hit and you have to take over his station while under fire, you won't have time to remember where the controls are. He pointed to a corner of the training area where a tent had been set up. That's your barracks, 4 cots, no privacy, no personal electronics, no phones. If there's an emergency, General Hartman knows how to reach me and I'll relay the message. Otherwise, for 90 days, your world is this training area, this tank, and each other. Questions? Ethan raised his hand like he was in a classroom. Bull gestured for him to speak. Colonel, I mean Bull, if we're not using modern systems, how is this going to prepare us for commanding current generation tanks? Bull smiled for the first time. It wasn't a warm smile. Private Park, you know how to use a calculator, but do you understand mathematics? You know how to use GPS. But do you understand land navigation? You know how to use a computer. But do you understand logic? I'm not here to teach you how to use modern systems. The Army has already done that, and you're excellent at it. I'm here to teach you to understand what those systems are doing so that when they fail, when the computers crash and the GPS goes down and the thermal sights stop working, you can still fight your tank and bring your crew home. Any other questions? Silence. 4 young faces staring at an old, and who had just told them their next 90 days would be harder than anything they had experienced so far. Good, mount up. I'm going to show you around your new home. Week 1, the fundamentals. They started with maintenance. Bull didn't let them start the engine, didn't let them load ammunition, didn't let them do anything that looked like tank commanding. Instead, he had them strip down the track assembly, remove each track pad, clean each connector, inspect each road wheel bearing, learn the tank from the ground up, literally on their hands and knees in the Georgia red clay. Deshaun took to it naturally. His loader's hands, built for lifting heavy objects in confined spaces, worked the track pins like they were made for the job. He didn't complain about the dirt or the grease or the back-breaking labor of removing 200 track pads and laying them out for inspection. Maria fought it. Bull could see her frustration building as hours turned into days, and they still hadn't fired a shot, hadn't driven the tank, hadn't done anything that looked like what she had signed up for. On the third day, as she wrestled with a stuck road wheel bolt, she threw her wrench and stood up. This is ridiculous. We're tank commanders, not mechanics. The Army has mechanics for this. We should be training tactics, not playing in the dirt. Bull was sitting in the shade of the tank's hull, watching. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, just spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had had this exact conversation 100 times before. Corporal Santos, what happens when your track throws a pad in the middle of a fight? We call for maintenance. And if maintenance is 30 minutes away and the enemy is 5 minutes away? Maria opened her mouth, closed it, saw where Bull was going. We fix it ourselves. And if you don't know how, silence. Then you sit in a immobilized tank and die. Or you abandon the tank and run, and maybe live, but definitely lose the only thing standing between you and enemy armor. Every tank commander in history has had to make field repairs or was under fire. Patton could rebuild a transmission. Rommel could replace a fuel pump. Your grandfather could swap out a final drive in 45 minutes with one hand, while the other hand held a rifle because someone needed to pull security. You think you're too good to learn this? Maria picked up her wrench, went back to work, didn't complain again. Jake was different. He attacked every task with quiet intensity, like he was trying to work off guilt through physical labor. Bull recognized the pattern, had lived it himself after the friendly fire incident in Iraq. The belief that if you just worked hard enough, if you just did everything perfectly, you could somehow balance the scales, make up for the mistake, earn redemption through exhaustion. On the 5th day, as Jake was cleaning the main gun barrel with an obsessive attention to detail, Bull climbed up next to him. You know the barrel's clean, right? You've been scrubbing the same spot for 10 minutes. Jake kept scrubbing. It needs to be perfect. No, it needs to be clean enough to function. Perfect doesn't exist in armor. Close enough is all you get. Jake finally stopped, sat back, looked at Bull with eyes that carried too much weight for 23 years. How do you live with it? With making a mistake that costs lives? Bull sat down next to him. 2 men on top of a tank, surrounded by pine trees and Georgia heat, having the conversation that was really the only conversation that mattered. You want the truth? You don't. You don't live with it. You survive it. You wake up every day and make the choice to keep going. You find purpose in making sure no one else makes the same mistake. You carry the weight because putting it down means forgetting, and forgetting means those deaths meant nothing. So you remember, every day, every single day. And eventually, 33 years later, you are still remembering, still carrying it. But you're also still here, still teaching, still trying to make sure the next lieutenant learns what you learned, so maybe he doesn't have to carry the same weight. Jake's voice broke. I see his face, PFC Morrison, my loader. Every time I close my eyes. He's 20 years old. He trusted me. And I almost got him killed because I was staring at a screen instead of looking at what was actually happening. Good. Jake looked at Bull like he had said something incomprehensible. Good? You see his face. That means you care. That means you understand the weight. The dangerous tank commanders are the ones who don't see faces, who treat it like a video game, who give orders and don't think about what those orders cost. You'll make mistakes again, Lieutenant. Every commander does. But you'll make them with eyes open. You'll make them knowing what they cost. And that knowledge will make you careful, will make you think, will make you the kind of tank commander who brings people home. They sat in silence for 5 minutes. Then Jake picked up his cleaning mop and went back to work. But the obsessive intensity was gone, replaced by something steadier, more sustainable. Ethan was the biggest surprise. The skinny kid with glasses who looked like he should be programming computers instead of commanding tanks turned out to have an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that bordered on supernatural. Give him a schematic once, and he could disassemble and reassemble components from memory. Ask him why something worked, and he could explain the engineering principles in terms that made complex systems seem simple. But his body couldn't keep up with his mind. By the end of the first week, his hands were blistered. His back was screaming. He moved like every muscle hurt, which they probably did. Bull found him on the sixth night sitting outside the tent, soaking his hands in a bucket of ice water, looking miserable. Thinking about quitting, Private Park? Ethan looked up, managed a weak smile. Every 5 minutes. Then I think about what going home and telling my parents I quit would feel like, and I keep going for another 5 minutes. Bull sat down next to him, pulled out the chrome Zippo, opened and closed it with the familiar click. You know what this is? A lighter. It's a promise. A man gave it to me 50 years ago when I was about your age. Told me that someday I'd give it to someone who understood what it meant. Every day for 50 years, I've carried it. Every day, it reminds me of the promise I made. To never leave a man behind. To never leave a tank behind. To pass forward what was passed to me. Ethan looked at the lighter like it was a religious artifact. Why are you showing me this? Because you're thinking about quitting. And I need you to understand that quitting means more than just going home. It means breaking a chain that goes back generations. Your body hurts right now. In a month, it'll hurt less. In 2 months, it'll be strong. But if you quit now, your mind will hurt forever. You'll always wonder if you could have made it. Always wonder if you were stronger than you thought. Don't give yourself that regret, Private. Trust me. I've seen what regret does to people over decades. It's worse than any physical pain. Ethan looked at his blistered hands, looked at the tank sitting in the darkness, looked at Bull. I'll stay. I know you will. You're not a quitter. You're just scared. That's okay. Every tank commander I ever met was scared. The difference between cowards and heroes isn't whether you feel fear. It's what you do despite feeling it. Bull stood up, started to walk away, turned back. In Private, lose the glasses. Get contacts. In a tank, glasses fog up, fall off, get in the way. You need to see clearly. Your crew depends on it. Ethan nodded, kept soaking his hands, kept not quitting. Week 2. Meeting the crew. Wednesday morning, 0600 hours. 3 men in civilian clothes stood next to Bull as the 4 candidates arrived. Marcus, Thomas, and Jose. 3 old men who looked like they should be at a VFW hall playing cards, not at a military training area. But when they stood next to Steel Providence, something shifted. They didn't look like old men anymore. They looked like what they were: combat veterans. Men who had been tested in ways that most people would never understand. Men who had earned the right to be here. Bull made introductions with economy. These are the men I served with in Desert Storm. Sergeant Marcus Williams, gunner. Corporal Thomas O'Brien, loader. Private First Class Jose Ramirez, driver. Together, the 4 of us crewed this tank through the Battle of 73 Easting. 90 minutes. 11 enemy tanks destroyed. 0 casualties in our crew. They're here because I asked them to be. Because there are things you need to hear that I can't teach you. Things that only come from men who have been where you're trying to go. He stepped back. Let Marcus take over. Marcus's preacher voice filled the training area with the resonance of a man used to commanding attention. 33 years ago, we sat in this tank in a desert storm so thick you couldn't see 30 meters. Radar said there were enemy tanks ahead. Our orders were to advance and engage, but we couldn't see them. Couldn't confirm targets visually. Had to trust technology that was brand new, that we'd only trained on for a few weeks. That might be wrong. He paused. Let the weight settle. Bull gave the order to fire based on a radar return. No visual confirmation, against every instinct that said you don't shoot at what you can't see. And he was right. We hit an Iraqi T-72 at 1,800 meters in 0 visibility. Destroyed it before they even knew we were there. But here's what you need to understand. If Bull had been wrong, if that radar return had been a friendly vehicle or a civilian truck or a Ghost Echo, we would have killed innocent people. Bull would have lived with that mistake for the rest of his life. He made the call in 0.3 seconds. He's been thinking about it for 33 years. Marcus pointed at Jake. You made a mistake that didn't kill anyone. It could have, but it didn't. You're carrying guilt for something that didn't happen. Bull is carrying guilt for things that did happen. 11 tanks, maybe 50 men. He did his job perfectly and people died. That's what command means. You make the right decision and people still die. The question isn't whether you can live with making mistakes. It's whether you can live with making correct decisions that have terrible costs. Thomas took over, holding up his damaged hand. See these fingers? I can't feel anything with them. Haven't been able to since '92. Loading accident. My fault. I rushed. Didn't follow procedure. The breach closed on my hand and took 2 fingers mostly off. Army docs reattached them, but the nerves never healed right. He flexed the dead fingers. Every day I look at this hand and remember that shortcuts kill. That procedures exist because people died to create them. That when you're in the steel and things are happening fast, the only thing standing between you and disaster is discipline. Not talent, not intelligence, discipline. The willingness to do things right every single time, even when you're tired and scared and everything in you wants to just go fast and get it over with. He looked at Deshaun. You're a loader. You're slow because you're thinking. Stop thinking. Let your body learn. Let muscle memory take over. But never, never shortcut the procedure. Because the day you do, you'll end up with a hand like mine. Or worse. Jose spoke last. His voice was quieter than the others, but carried weight that came from a different place. A darker place. I don't sleep well. Haven't since 1991. Every night I see the tanks burning, hear the screaming on the radio, smell the smoke. The docs call it PTSD. I call it the price I paid for survival. 71 years old and I still can't drive past a trash fire without having a panic attack. Can't handle crowds. Can't watch fireworks. Can't live a normal life because my brain is still stuck in that desert waiting for the next shot to come in. He looked at all 4 candidates. You think you want this. You think commanding a tank is about glory and honor and serving your country, and it is. But it's also about waking up at 3 a.m. for the rest of your life, seeing faces of people you killed or couldn't save. It's about never being able to explain to your family why loud noises make you duck. It's about living with ghosts that no one else can see. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to make sure you understand the cost before you pay it. Because once you pay it, you can't get a refund. You carry it forever. The 4 candidates stood silent. 4 young people confronting the reality that their teachers had been very carefully not telling them. That war had costs that extended far beyond the battlefield. That survival wasn't the same as winning. That you could do everything right and still spend the rest of your life paying for it. Bull stepped forward again. You have 24 hours to decide if you want to continue. No shame in walking away. This isn't for everyone, but if you stay, understand that we're not just teaching you to command a tank. We're preparing you for what comes after. For the weight you'll carry, for the memories that don't fade, for the cost of survival. Think about it. Tomorrow morning, when you show up, you're committing. No second chances, no backing out. You're all in or you're gone, dismissed. The 4 candidates walked back to their tent in silence. Bull and his crew watched them go. Marcus spoke first. You think they'll stay? Bull clicked the Zippo, felt its familiar weight. All 4, they're scared now. But scared people who stay are the ones who become good commanders. The ones who walk away were never going to make it anyway. Thomas flexed his damaged hand. This is harder than combat, Bull. Combat, you just react. This, you have to open yourself up. Let them see the scars, the wounds, the parts we spend decades hiding from everyone, including ourselves. Jose stared at the tent where 4 young people were probably having the most important conversation of their lives. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the real training isn't teaching them to fight tanks. Maybe it's teaching them to face themselves, to understand what they're capable of and what it costs, to choose this life with eyes open. Bull looked at Steel Providence, at the tank that had carried 4 men through hell and brought them home, at the steel that remembered. Mackenzie told me 50 years ago that steel is steel, but men are something more. Tomorrow we find out if these 4 understand what that something more is. If they're ready to become tank commanders. If they're strong enough to carry the weight. The sun set over Fort Benning. 4 old men stood next to a tank that had seen war. 4 young people sat in a tent deciding whether to walk toward that same war or turn away while they still could. And in the darkness, the steel waited, patient, eternal, ready to teach its lessons to whoever was brave enough or foolish enough to climb inside and start the engine. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Georgia dawn that promised rain before noon. Bull stood next to Steel Providence at 05:45 hours, 15 minutes before the candidates were supposed to report. He had been there since 0500, unable to sleep, wondering if 4 empty cots would greet the sunrise, or if 4 young people had found the courage to continue. At 0557 hours, the tent flap opened. Jake Reynolds emerged first, dressed in his physical training uniform, boots laced tight, moving with purpose. Then Maria Santos, her face set in determined lines. Deshaun Miller followed, looking like he had not slept much, but had made peace with whatever kept him awake. Finally, Ethan Park, without his glasses, squinting slightly but standing straighter than Bull had seen him stand before. They formed up in front of Bull without being told. 4 people who had made a choice, who had looked at the crowd and decided they were willing to pay it. Bull let 30 seconds of silence pass, then nodded once. Good, let's get to work. Weeks 3 through 8, the Crucible. They learned the tank from the inside out, rotated through every station. Jake commanded from the turret while Maria gunned and Deshaun loaded and Ethan drove. Then they switched. Maria commanded, Deshaun gunned, Ethan loaded, Jake drove. Every possible combination until the distinctions between positions blurred and they understood that a tank commander was not just someone who sat in the commander's hatch. A tank commander was someone who could do every job and understood how each position depended on the others. Marcus came 3 days a week to teach gunnery, not the computer-assisted gunnery they had learned in modern tanks, but the old way. Reading range cards, calculating lead for moving targets, understanding that between the moment you identified a threat and the moment your round impacted, the world moved and changed, and you had to predict where everything would be, not where it was. Maria excelled at this. Her mind processed spatial relationships and movement vectors with an intuitive understanding that could not be taught. By week 5, she could hit moving targets at 1,500 meters using manual calculations and pure instinct. Marcus watched her work and nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher recognizing genuine talent. Your grandmother would be proud, Corporal Santos. She was artillery, right? Fire direction control. Maria looked surprised that Marcus knew. Yes, how did you know? Because you think like artillery. You see the battlefield in grids and coordinates and trajectories. That's rare in armor. Most tank gunners think in snapshots, point and shoot, but you think in systems. That makes you dangerous, in the best possible way. Thomas came twice a week to work with Deshaun on loading. Not just the physical mechanics of moving 40-pound rounds from the ready rack to the breech, but the rhythm of it. The flow state that good loaders achieved where thought disappeared and only action remained. Stop thinking about the round. Stop thinking about your hands. Stop thinking at all. Feel the tank. Feel the recoil when we fire. Feel the commander's voice. Feel the urgency. Let your body respond without your brain getting in the way. By week 6, Deshaun was loading at 4.8 seconds. By week 7, 4.3. His massive hands moved with surgical precision, placing rounds with millimeter accuracy, never rushing but never slow, finding the zone where speed and safety coexisted. Thomas watched him work and held up his damaged hand. You're better than I was, Private Miller. Faster and more careful. You have the touch, the gift. Don't waste it. And don't ever shortcut the procedure. Not even when you're this good. Especially when you're this good. Because that's when complacency kills. Jose came once a week, always on the same day, always at the same time because routine helped him maintain control. He taught Ethan to drive. Not the sanitized driving they learned in basic training, following roads and respecting terrain, but combat driving. How to move fast over broken ground. How to use terrain for cover. How to read the land and understand where you could go and where physics would kill you. Driving a tank is not like driving a car. A car, you die. Maybe you and a few others. A tank, you die. Your whole crew dies. The infantry following you dies. Maybe the whole battle shifts because you made a mistake and put your tank somewhere it could not fight or could not escape. You are not just a driver. You are the foundation everything else is built on. If you fail, everyone fails. Ethan absorbed this with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge could compensate for physical limitations. By week 8, he could navigate terrain in the dark using only instinct and memory, feeling the tank respond to his commands like an extension of his own body. Jose watched him thread Steel Providence through a narrow gap between trees that looked impossible and nodded with grudging respect. You drive like you're scared of killing everyone. Good. Stay scared. Confident drivers make mistakes. Scared drivers stay alive. But the real teaching happened in the moments between formal training. In the evenings when Bull would sit with them around a small fire outside their tent and tell stories. Not war stories full of glory and heroism, but the other stories, the ones that did not make it into official histories. About the time in Desert Storm when Bull's tank had to drive past burning Iraqi vehicles, with men still inside, still screaming, and there was nothing they could do because stopping meant dying and the war did not pause for mercy. About the night after the battle when Marcus sat on the tank's fender and cried for an hour because his one good eye had seen too much and could not unsee it. About the loader before Thomas, the one who died, and how Thomas had to push his friend's body aside to keep loading because the fight was not over and grief was a luxury that came later, if you survived. About Jose's first panic attack, 3 months after coming home, in a grocery store when someone dropped a can and the sound triggered something in his brain that sent him diving for cover while shoppers stared and his wife cried, and he realized that part of him would never leave the desert. The 4 candidates listened to these stories with the intensity of students recognizing that they were being taught something that could not be found in any manual. That the real curriculum was not about operating tanks. It was about surviving the act of operating them. About staying human while doing inhuman things. About carrying weight that never got lighter. Week 10, the revelation. General Hartman visited on a Tuesday morning. She arrived in an official vehicle with an aide, moving with the brisk efficiency of a flag officer with too many demands on too little time. But when she saw the 4 candidates working on Steel Providence, something in her expression softened. They were running crew drills, Bull calling out simulated contacts while they rotated through stations, each candidate taking turns commanding, each learning to trust the others to do their jobs while focusing on their own. The movements were smooth now, practiced. The sharp edges of individual egos had been worn down by 10 weeks of shared hardship into something that looked like the beginning of a real crew. Hartman watched for 15 minutes without interrupting, then approached Bull, who had been observing from a distance, letting them work without his direct supervision. Colonel Harrison, they look different. Bull nodded. They are different, still rough, still learning, but they are starting to understand. Understand what? That they are not 4 individuals operating a machine. They are one crew inhabiting steel. That distinction makes all the difference. Hartman was quiet for a moment, watching Maria bark orders while Jake executed them without hesitation, without ego, trusting her judgment. Watching Deshaun anticipate the rhythm and feed rounds before being told. Watching Ethan navigate terrain while monitoring 3 other conversations, his mind tracking multiple threads simultaneously. I have news. The National Training Center has approved your request for final evaluation. 4 weeks from now, they will run a modified scenario. Peer-level threat, no modern tanks for the opposition since your crew is operating vintage equipment, but everything else will be current doctrine, electronic warfare, combined arms, realistic opposition force. Bull absorbed this. 4 weeks. Not enough time to perfect everything, but enough time to prepare them for what was coming. What are the pass criteria? Mission accomplishment, crew survival, demonstration of tactical judgment. The board will evaluate not just whether they complete the objective, but how they complete it. Whether they make decisions that protect their crew while accomplishing the mission. Whether they can operate effectively when systems fail and plans fall apart. And if they pass, full reinstatement to tank commander qualification track. Clean records. The training accidents and failures expunged. They get their careers back. And if they fail, Hartman's expression hardened slightly. Then I have wasted 90 days and considerable resources on an experiment that did not work. And they go home, permanently. Bull understood the weight she was carrying. The political risk of bringing in a retired colonel to run an unsanctioned training program. The professional consequences if this failed. Hartman had put her credibility on the line for 4 candidates that the system had already written off. They will not fail, General. They may not be perfect, but they will not fail. Hartman studied Bull's face, saw something there that made her nod. I believe you. I also wanted to tell you something else. something that is not in any official record. She gestured to her aide, who handed her a folder. Hartman opened it, showing Bull a photograph. An older photograph, creased and faded. Frank Mackenzie in a hospital bed, missing his left leg, but smiling. Next to him stood a young captain. Bull recognized himself, 40 years younger, holding a chrome Zippo lighter. Mackenzie kept this photo until he died. It was in his personal effects. His daughter found it when she was going through his things. She wanted you to have it. Bull took the photograph with hands that wanted to shake, but did not. Looked at two men separated by rank and age and experience, connected by something deeper than any of those surface distinctions. Hartman continued, her voice softer now. His daughter also found a letter, written to you, sealed, with instructions that it should be delivered if his grandson ever joined armor and found his way to your training. She gave it to me to give to you. Hartman handed Bull a sealed envelope. Old paper. Mackenzie's handwriting on the outside. To Bull Harrison, to be opened when Jake needs to know. Bull held the letter like it was made of something more fragile than paper, like it contained weight that could not be measured in ounces. Thank you, General. Hartman nodded, returned to her vehicle. Left Bull standing alone with a photograph and a letter from a dead man who had shaped his life more than any living person ever had. Bull did not open the letter immediately. Waited until evening, until the candidates were in their tent and the training area was quiet except for the sound of wind in the pines. Then he sat on the fender of Steel Providence, exactly where Marcus had sat and cried 33 years ago, and broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 2018, a year before Mackenzie died. Bull, if you are rating this, then Jake found you, or you found him. Either way, the chain continues. I am writing this from a hospital bed. Cancer. The doctors give me months, maybe a year, but I am not afraid of dying. I made peace with death in Normandy. What concerns me is what I leave behind. Jake is a good boy, smart, dedicated, but he carries something heavy, a fear that he is not good enough, that he will fail when it matters, that he will let people down. I recognize this fear because I saw it in you 50 years ago, saw you struggling with the weight of command, questioning every decision, wondering if you had what it took. I gave you the lighter because I believed you did have what it took, but more importantly, because I wanted you to believe it. The lighter was never about me or the sergeant who gave it to me. It was about the chain, about passing forward the knowledge that you are not alone, that every tank commander before you faced the same fears and questions and doubts, that you stand on the shoulders of men who succeeded despite their fears, not because they lacked them. Jake will need that lesson. He will need to know that doubt is not weakness, that fear is not failure, that the best commanders are the ones who question themselves because they understand the weight of their decisions. Teach him what you taught yourself, how to carry the weight without letting it crush you, how to make impossible decisions and live with them, how to honor the dead by living well and passing forward what they taught you. The lighter is his when he is ready. You will know when that is. Trust your judgment. You have earned that right through 5 decades of service and sacrifice. I wish I could be there to see him receive it, but I will be watching from wherever old soldiers go when their wars are finally over. Thank you for being the man I believed you could become. Thank you for proving that my faith was not misplaced. Your friend always, Frank Mackenzie, Iron Horse. Bull read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket next to the lighter. Sat in the darkness feeling the presence of a man who had been dead for 5 years, but whose influence reached across decades like a hand on the shoulder, steady and sure. Week 12, the final test. The National Training Center in California was 500 miles from Fort Benning. They drove Steel Providence there on a transport trailer, Bull and his 4 candidates following in a van, the journey taking 2 days with an overnight stop in Texas. During that drive, Bull told them what they would face: a mechanized enemy force with armor and infantry and air support, electronic jamming that would kill their radios periodically, a moving objective that required tactical decision-making under pressure, time limits that forced speed over caution. Everything designed to test not their technical skills, which the Army already knew were adequate, but their judgment under pressure. The opposition force will use current tactics. They will try to separate you from supporting elements. They will hit you with multiple threats simultaneously to overload your decision-making. They will create situations where there is no perfect answer, only choices between bad options and worse ones. This is not about whether you can fight the tank. This is about whether you can lead the crew when everything is on fire. Jake spoke from the back of the van, his voice steady. What happens if we die? In the simulation, I mean. Bull met his eyes in the rearview mirror. Then you die. The scenario ends. You fail. And you go home understanding that the decisions you made were inadequate. But you also go home alive, which is more than you would get in real combat. The simulation is forgiving in exactly one way. It lets you learn from fatal mistakes. Real combat does not offer that luxury. Maria leaned forward. You will be there? Observing? Bull shook his head. No, once the scenario starts, you are alone. 4 of you in that steel. No one can help you. No one can advise you. You succeed or fail based solely on what you have learned and whether you can apply it under stress. That is the point, to prove you can function without someone holding your hand. Ethan's voice was quiet. Are we ready? Bulka considered the question. Thought about 12 weeks of training, about 4 individuals who had become something like a crew, about rough edges that had been smoothed and gaps that had been filled in the 10,000 small lessons that accumulated into something that resembled competence. Ready is not the right word. You are prepared. You have the skills and knowledge and experience to succeed. But ready implies certainty, and there is no certainty in combat. You will make mistakes. You will face moments where you do not know what to do. The question is whether you can make decisions anyway, whether you can trust each other and trust yourselves and keep moving forward even when everything is uncertain. That is what we have been training, not readiness, resilience. They arrived at the National Training Center on a Sunday evening, spent Monday doing final checks on Steel Providence, making sure every system functioned, every round loaded correctly, every piece of equipment secured. The work was meditative, familiar, a way to channel nervousness into productive action. Marcus, Thomas, and Jose arrived Monday night. They had driven from Georgia together, 3 old men in Thomas's pickup truck, making the pilgrimage to watch 4 young people face the test that would define their careers. That night, they all sat around Steel Providence under the California stars. 7 people connected by steel and history and the shared understanding that tomorrow would change everything. Bull spoke first. Tomorrow you will climb into this tank as students. When you climb out, you will be tank commanders. Not because you passed a test, but because you will have proven to yourselves that you can make decisions that matter, that you can carry the weight, that you understand what your grandfather and Thomas and Jose and I learned decades ago. That steel is steel, but the crew is everything. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the chrome Zippo, held it so the starlight caught the engraving. This lighter has passed through 4 hands over 80 years, Normandy to Fulda Gap to Desert Storm to here. Each man who carried it understood that it represented something bigger than himself, a promise, a commitment, a chain of knowledge and sacrifice that could not be allowed to break. Bull handed the lighter to Jake. Your grandfather wanted you to have this, not because you are his blood, but because you have earned the right to carry it, because you looked at the cost and chose to pay it anyway, because you understand that being a tank commander is not about glory or promotion or personal achievement. It is about the 3 people who trust you with their lives and your absolute commitment to bringing them home. Jake took the lighter with hands that trembled slightly, opened it, closed it, heard the click that had echoed across decades. I do not know if I deserve this. Bull's voice was firm. None of us did. The sergeant who gave it to your grandfather probably did not think he deserved it either. But deserve is not the point. Responsibility is the point. You carry it now, and someday, when you are old and some young lieutenant is standing where you are standing now, you will pass it forward. That is how the chain continues. Marcus stood, placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. Corporal Santos, your family has served in armor for 3 generations. Tomorrow you will prove you are worthy of that legacy, not because you have to, because you already have. Trust your training, trust your crew, trust yourself. Thomas approached Deshaun, holding up his damaged hand. Private Miller, you have the touch, the gift. You are the best loader I have seen in 40 years. Tomorrow that gift will keep your crew alive. Remember that? When it gets hard, when you are tired, when you want to slow down, remember that your speed is their survival. Jose stood in front of Ethan, and for the first time in 12 weeks, his eyes were completely clear, focused, present. Private Park, you are smarter than any of us. But tomorrow you cannot think your way through this. You have to feel it. Trust your instincts. Trust the steel. You know how to drive this tank better than you know anything else in your life. Tomorrow, prove it. They stood together in the darkness. 7 people about to separate. 4 to face their test. 3 to watch and wait and remember what it felt like to be young and scared and about to prove something to yourself that no one else could prove for you. Bull spoke the final words. Tomorrow you are Steel Providence, the 5th crew to inhabit this tank. The first crew that never saw combat but trained as if they would. Win or lose, pass or fail, you will climb out of that steel knowing you gave everything. That is all any commander can ask of their crew. All in? 4 voices answered in unison. All in. The scenario. Dawn came cold and clear. The 4 candidates mounted Steel Providence at 0600 hours, strapped into their stations. Ran pre-combat checks. Reported ready at Yo 615. Bull, Marcus, Thomas, and Jose stood with General Hartman and a dozen observers in a command post 3 miles from the starting point. Banks of monitors showed multiple angles. Radios transmitted crew communications. Computers tracked movement and engagement parameters. But Bull did not watch the screens. He watched Hartman's face, watched the senior evaluators, watched the subtle body language that would tell him whether the crew was succeeding or failing. The scenario began at 0630 with a simulated artillery barrage that forced immediate movement. Jake's voice came through the speakers, calm and decisive. Driver, back 70 meters to the tree line. Gunner, scan east sector. Loader, prepare sabot. Moving now. The tank displaced, found cover, waited. Jake was not rushing, not reacting without thinking. He was applying the lessons, creating space to make decisions. The first contact came 10 minutes later. 2 simulated enemy vehicles appearing on the ridgeline, 800 meters out. Maria's voice, sharp and clear. Identified, 2 BMPs, range 800, permission to engage. Jake's response was immediate. Negative. Watch and wait. They have not seen us. Let them come closer. This was judgment, not shooting because you could, but waiting because patience was sometimes the better weapon. The evaluators leaned forward, watching, assessing. The enemy vehicles moved closer. 700 meters, 600. Jake let them come, waited until they were committed to their route, then gave the order. Gunner, left target, sabot, fire when ready. On the way. The simulation registered a hit. The enemy vehicle exploded digitally. Jake did not wait for confirmation. Loader, reload sabot, gunner, right target, fire when ready. Up. On the way. Second hit. 2 enemy vehicles destroyed in 11 seconds. But Jake was already moving the tank again, not waiting to see results, understanding that staying in position after firing meant death. The scenario escalated. More enemy contacts, a simulated air attack that forced them into covered positions, electronic jamming that killed their radio for 8 minutes, forcing them to operate independently without guidance, a breakdown in Allied support that left them isolated. Through it all, the crew adapted. When the radio died, they continued the mission using map and compass and dead reckoning. When supporting units failed to arrive, they improvised. When the plan fell apart, they made new plans. Maria's gunnery was surgical. Deshawn's loading never slowed below 4.5 seconds, even under maximum stress. Ethan's driving threaded the tank through impossible terrain without guidance. And Jake held it together, making decisions in 0.3 seconds, trusting his crew, keeping them alive. At 0947 hours, the scenario presented the critical test. A simulated friendly vehicle, call sign broken by jamming, appeared in Jake's engagement area. IFF was not functioning due to electronic warfare. Visual identification was inconclusive due to dust and distance. Jake had 3 seconds to decide. Fire and risk killing friendlies. Hold fire and risk letting an enemy through to kill others. Bull held his breath. This was the moment, the impossible choice, the decision that would define whether Jake had learned the real lesson. Jake's voice came through the speakers. Gunner, hold fire. Driver, move to intercept. I need visual confirmation before we engage. Loader, be ready. It was the right call, the harder call, trusting judgment over reflex. The vehicle turned out to be friendly. Crisis averted. But Jake had made the decision without certainty, had accepted risk to avoid a worse outcome, had demonstrated the quality that could never be taught in simulators, the judgment of a tank commander. The scenario ended at 10:15 hours, mission accomplished, all objectives secured. Zero simulated casualties. The crew had functioned flawlessly under pressure. Steel Providence's engine shut down. Silence fell over the training area. 4 candidates climbed out of the tank looking exhausted and exhilarated and fundamentally changed by what they had just experienced. General Hartman stood, walked to the evaluation board, conferred quietly for 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours, then turned to face Bull. Colonel Harrison, the board's verdict is unanimous. Pass. Full qualification approved. These candidates have demonstrated tactical judgment, crew cohesion, and leadership under pressure. They are cleared to return to tank commander qualification track with full privileges. Bull nodded once, showing nothing, but inside something that had been clenched tight for 12 weeks finally released. Hartman continued, speaking now to the 4 candidates who were standing at attention next to their tank. Lieutenant Reynolds, Corporal Santos, Private First Class Miller, Private Park, you came here as failures. You leave as tank commanders. Not because you operated a machine successfully, but because you demonstrated that you understand what that machine represents. 30 tons of steel that becomes something more when inhabited by people who trust each other completely. Congratulations, you have earned this. She saluted. They returned the salute with precision that came from 12 weeks of being held to standards higher than any official regulation required. Epilogue, 6 months later. The sun was setting over Fort Benning when Bull returned to the Patton Museum. Steel Providence had been returned to its place of honor in the exhibit hall, polished and perfect, looking nothing like the battered training tank it had been for 90 days. But Bull could see past the polish, could see 4 young people learning what it meant to be a crew, could see Marcus and Thomas and Jose passing forward the lessons they had earned in blood and sand, could see the continuation of a chain that stretched back generations. Helen found him standing in front of the tank, lost in memory. You did good work, Bull. Those 4 went on to their advanced courses. Word is they are all top of their class. You gave them something no one else could. Bull smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. I gave them what was given to me. That is all any of us can do. Pass it forward, keep the chain unbroken. His phone buzzed. A text message from Jake Reynolds. Bull, reporting for duty at Fort Hood next month. Tank platoon leader. 20 soldiers depending on me. Scared to death. But I keep the lighter with me. Keep remembering what you taught us. Steel is steel, crew is everything. Thank you for everything. Jake. Bull typed a response. You will do fine. Trust your training. Trust your crew. Trust yourself. And when the time comes, pass it forward. The chain continues through you now. Proud of you. Bull. He put the phone away, looked at Steel Providence one more time, placed his hand on the armor plate the way he had done 10,000 times before. Marcus appeared beside him, moving quietly despite his size. You okay, Bull? Bull nodded. Better than okay. For 50 years I carried the lighter wondering if I was worthy of it, wondering if I had done enough to honor the men who came before. Today I know. I passed it forward. The chain continues. That is all that matters. Thomas joined them, flexing his damaged hand. You know what Jake told me last week? Said he wants to start a program at Hood, teaching tank commanders the old way. No computers first, just steel and crew and judgment. Said he is going to call it the Iron Horse Legacy Program after Mackenzie. Jose appeared last, moving with less tension than Bull had seen in 30 years. The kid asked me to come teach driving, few times a year. I told him I would think about it. But I am going to say yes. Maybe helping the next generation will help me sleep better. Maybe passing it forward is the therapy I needed all along. The 4 of them stood together. 4 old men looking at a tank that had carried them through war and peace and everything in between. 4 men who had started as individuals and become something more. A crew. Brothers. The living embodiment of the lesson they had spent 12 weeks teaching. That steel was steel, but men were something more. That the weight never disappeared, you just got stronger carrying it. That a tank commander's first duty was to the crew. Always the crew. That the chain could not break. The knowledge passed down, the wisdom earned, the obligation honored. Bull reached into his pocket, felt the space where the lighter had lived for 50 years. Empty now, but not hollow, because the lighter had found its next keeper. And someday when Jake was old and gray and standing where Bull stood now, he would pass it forward to someone who needed to know. That was how the chain continued, not through steel or technology or systems, but through people, through the simple act of one generation teaching the next, through the willingness to carry weight and pass forward what had been passed to you, through the understanding that serving something bigger than yourself was not sacrifice. It was privilege. It was purpose. It was the one thing that made all the pain and fear and loss worthwhile. Bull Harrison left the museum that evening feeling lighter than he had felt in decades, not because the weight was gone, but because he had finally shared it with people who could carry it forward. The chain continued. The legacy lived. The promise was kept. And somewhere in whatever place old soldiers went when their wars were finally over, Frank McKenzie smiled and knew that his faith had not been misplaced, that the lighter would continue its journey, passing from hand to hand, generation to generation, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of every tank commander who had ever understood that steel was just steel, but crew was everything.